Thank you for joining us tonight for this. Thank you for joining us tonight for this Books in Common Northwest event with Thor Hanson, author of Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid, The Fraught and Fascinating Biology of Climate Change. I'm Lane Jacobson, the owner of Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon. This event is part of Books in Common Northwest, a virtual event series brought to you by us here at Paulina Springs, as well as Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Before we get into things, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you're having any technical difficulties, we recommend exiting and re-entering the Zoom presentation. And if that doesn't work, the event is also being live streamed on the Books in Common Northwest YouTube page, where you'll also be able to find a recording of this event after it concludes. If you're having any audio issues, we recommend plugging in some headphones, as that usually does the trick. And a reminder also that this is a shared creative space, and we ask that everyone in attendance be respectful of other attendees. Any offensive behavior or questions will result in being kicked out of the session. As I mentioned, this is a part of a virtual event series, and we have plenty of other exciting events scheduled for the rest of fall. You can view a full calendar on the Books in Common Northwest Eventbrite page, which is updated regularly. And we are here first and foremost to support the launch of Thor's book. And the best way to do that is to purchase the book. So we'll be dropping links into the chat throughout the show where you can do just that. And there's also a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your own questions and vote on other questions that you'd most like to hear answered when we get to our Q&A section at the end of the presentation. We'll get to as many of those as time allows. And please do feel free to drop your questions in there. We all love the audience participation, and it gets us a little bit closer to feeling like we are all in the same room doing live events again. With all of that out of the way, I'm going to introduce our guest for the evening and then pass things off to him. Thor Hanson is a conservation biologist, Guggenheim Fellow, and the author of award-winning books including Buzz, Feathers, The Impenetrable Forest, and The Triumph of Seeds. He lives with his wife and son on an island in Washington State. And without further ado, welcome, Thor, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Lane. It is a pleasure to be with all of you virtually. I know we'd love to be in the same room, but nonetheless, we can thank the Zoom gods for this virtual opportunity, connecting not only 3 bookstores, but stretching all the way out here to San Juan Island, where I live up here in Washington State. So it is nice to have a real solid Pacific Northwest event. We're really touching all the corners here. And before we get started, I want to mention or reiterate what Lane said is if you do have questions, and I hope you do, burning questions as things go on, just throw them into the Q&A chat there, and we'll get them at the end. And I'm going to launch in with a presentation for you that'll take about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll get to questions after that and discussion and so forth. So now, if you will bear with me, I'm going to try what the Zoom people tell us is a sharing of a portion of my screen. And I hope that you can see the book cover now. Is that correct?
I think we are all good.
Okay, good. If you guys see a book cover, then we're in business. But what I want to begin with, rather than the cover of the book, which you've already seen now, is a very familiar image. An iconic image of climate change, which is the poor polar bear stranded on a melting iceberg. And I think this has really become our go-to symbol for the biological impacts of the crisis. So much so that I have come to think that the conversation far too often stops there. In the media and in all kinds of public discourse, we invoke this image, the poor polar bear on the iceberg, and then we move on, overlooking a rich and truly vital biological story that really lies at the heart of all climate change scenarios. Because what matters most is not so much the change itself as it is the responses to the change. I mean, if every species got along just as well in all sorts of conditions, then tweaking the weather one way or another wouldn't matter in the slightest. But we know that's not how biodiversity works. Nature is the result of specialization, a great accumulation of species that are all adapted to particular sets of environmental conditions and relationships. And when the conditions of the climate change, those species react. And it is the sum of those responses that will determine the future, theirs as well as our own. So what I want to do this evening is to really focus on the challenges that climate change creates for plants and animals, and then the many ways that we can go out and measure their responses playing out in real time all around us. We won't be talking too much about the process of climate change itself, the atmospheric stuff, with one notable exception: carbon dioxide. Has there ever been any substance on Earth so often invoked and so seldom explained? Before I began this project, I realized that I hardly knew anything about the stuff that was making the planet warm in the first place. I mean, in high school, I do recall that the chemistry textbook pictured CO2 as a large black ball, the carbon atom, bookended by two smallish red ones, the oxygen. And at the time, I recall thinking that it looked just like the face of the red-eyed fruit flies that we had been studying the past semester in biology. And that association has stuck with me ever since. So when the link between climate change and CO2 became notorious, I found myself imagining the world's tailpipes and smokestacks emitting these great clouds of tiny flies. It's a vivid image, perhaps, but not exactly helpful in terms of explaining the situation, because carbon dioxide is really something of a paradox. It's a global threat, but it also happens to be one of the building blocks for life on Earth. It's everywhere, which may help explain why it was the first atmospheric gas ever to be identified. In fact, before the discovery of carbon dioxide, scientists weren't sure whether or not the atmosphere had contained anything that one could measure. It was truly mysterious. So credit for the discovery of CO2 goes largely to this fellow here, Joseph Priestley, who was an 18th century English clergyman. He was a chemist. He was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. He was a philosopher. He was just an all-around polymath. And he, in turn, credits his discovery and his work upon carbon dioxide to, quote, living for some time in the neighborhood of a public brewery. He was right next door to a brewery, and there he found quantities of this colorless, odorless gas collecting above the fermentation vats. He was also lucky enough to find brewers who were patient enough with their neighbor to let him build a scaffold over the top of those vats of fermenting beer and lower all manner of experiments into that invisible cloud. He learned that it would snuff out a candle flame, and he knew that it was heavy because it would carry the smoke from that flame down towards the brewery floor. He saw that small animals and insects could not breathe in the gas, and he saw that he could dissolve it in water, producing what he called a beverage, a fizzy beverage with a pleasant, acidulous taste. Now that discovery, and it earned him the famous Copley Medal from the Fellows of the Royal Society of London. Their annual meeting, they awarded him this great prestigious prize. But it earned quite a lot more for an entrepreneur named Johann Schwepp, who heard about it and copied Priestley's methods and founded the tonic and soda water company that still bears his name. Now, Priestley's work on CO2 paved the way for a whole raft of other experiments. Scientists soon learned that carbon dioxide would retain radiant heat. And as early as the 1890s, they predicted that industrial activities were already adding enough of it to the atmosphere to change the climate of the planet, to warm the planet Earth. Of course, that work was done in snowy Sweden, where the idea of adding a few extra degrees to the atmosphere was generally greeted with gusto. So people have known for a long time that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas, but that still doesn't explain why some of it is bad and some of it is benign. To get my head around that distinction and to get my hands on some CO2, I conducted a little experiment at home with my son, Noah, on various contents of our refrigerator. And I would like to share that story with you straight out of the book. It's from the second chapter, which begins with a quote that is attributed to Galileo, who said, "We must measure all that is measurable and strive to make measurable all that is not." It turns out that fermentation occurs in a lot more places than vats of beer. Yogurt and cheese makers call it culturing, but it's more accurate to think of it as a form of slow microbial digestion, a way for bacteria and other tiny organisms to extract and use energy from the foods they live within and around. And like any form of digestion, it is a process that produces waste. Luckily for food lovers, the byproducts of fermentation include things like alcohol, thus the beer, and lactic acid, which adds tanginess and pungency to such cultured favorites as kimchi and buttermilk. Most fermentation also produces carbon dioxide, which is what had me combing through the back reaches of our refrigerator. A container of organic sauerkraut advertised probiotic punch and claimed it's alive. But any organisms that kraut might have once contained had long since shuffled off their mortal coils and were no longer producing carbon dioxide. A lit match held above the briny mix burned brightly. Experiments with yogurt and sour cream were similarly disappointing, but then we hit the jackpot. On the bottom shelf, behind the bags of carrots and celery, sat a half-gallon jar of homemade pickles. They had been stewing in their own juices since August and tasted yeasty as well as sour, suggesting that fungi had joined the bacteria in their digestive pursuits. Frankly, it was past time to throw the pickles out, but for once, procrastinating a chore had paid off. As soon as Noah and I brought a match near that open lid, the flame demonstrated why carbon dioxide is such a common ingredient in fire extinguishers. With no oxygen to burn, the match went out in an instant, as if we'd turned off a switch. What's more, smoke from the snuff tip curled downward, trapped in the gas, just as Priestley had described. "It's pouring down the side," Noah exclaimed, watching as wisps of smoke followed the heavy vapors over the jar rim and down to spread across the countertop. "That's it," I told him. "You saw the carbon dioxide." He quickly brought me back to earth. "I didn't see the carbon dioxide, Papa. I saw the smoke." But like Priestley before us, we could use that smoke to watch the gas, defining its boundaries as it flowed and swirled around the open jar. For a few minutes, our kitchen was filled with the thrill of discovery as we lit match after match, watching them snuff and smolder until all the carbon dioxide had dissipated into the surrounding air. Simple experiments often lead to broader insights, and repeating Priestley's fermentation trick brought up an obvious question. Do pickles cause climate change? Does making beer? The answer, of course, is no. But understanding why some carbon emissions are harmless while others are not reveals a basic truth about climate change that we rarely stop to think about. In the case of our pickle jar, the carbon dioxide in the carbon came from the cucumbers in the brine, and the cucumbers had gotten it from the air around our garden the previous summer. Like plants everywhere, their growth relied upon photosynthesis, that leafy process of combining carbon dioxide with water and energy from the sun to create starches. In other words, carbon dioxide puts the carbo in carbohydrates. When those starches break down, the carbon dioxide goes back into the atmosphere. This is the step in the Earth's carbon cycle with which we are most familiar, because we play a role in it every moment of every day. Whether we eat plants or eat animals that have eaten plants, the energy that fuels our bodies traces right back to those photosynthetic starches, and we release carbon dioxide with every exhaled breath. But in terms of climate change, breathing is like making pickles or brewing beer, guilt-free. That's because our bodies are just one short stop for carbon on its continuous circuit from the air through plants and animals and back again, with no net gain or loss. If that's all there was to the story, then the planet wouldn't be warming, and I wouldn't be giving this lecture. The reality of modern climate change hinges on one key fact. Not all plants break down. Consider the pickle. Cucumbers eaten fresh or left to rot in the garden compost release their carbon right away. But that process slows down considerably in a jar of salty brine. Under the right conditions, it can stop altogether. In nature, this occurs primarily in two locations, the ocean floor and boggy wetlands. When marine algae sink to the floor of the ocean, and they sometimes get buried before they are eaten or decomposed, and in bogs, dead plants pile up, forming layer upon layer of peat. In either case, if sediments and rocks develop above and around these organic deposits, their carbon is effectively trapped, removed from the atmosphere, and locked away for millions and millions of years. Transformed by heat, pressure, we recognize these ancient plants as the fossil fuels. Petroleum from the algae, we get coal from the peat, and we get natural gas from either. Burning them now returns all of that stockpiled carbon dioxide into the air at once, overwhelming the natural cycle of breathing and making pickles, and leading to the many consequences now unfolding. So the next time you find something at the back of the fridge that looks like a scientific experiment, it is a scientific experiment. There's a lot to be learned there. And it is a good reminder that even the atmospheric aspects of modern climate change are rooted in biology. So we know that the climate is warming and we know why, but that still doesn't explain what it means for plants and animals. As you can imagine, that is now a booming field in biology. Climate impacts are so widespread that it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that all biologists are studying climate change. Some of them just haven't realized it yet. And it helps to organize that deluge of information into themes. And one of the most common themes in climate change research has to do with timing. At Walden Pond, for example, the violets and the wood sorrel that Henry David Thoreau admired in May and June now bloom by late April. And what he called the early yellow smell of willows can reliably be savored in March. Spring is arriving earlier and earlier. You can see it happen in your own backyard. And if you write your observations down, as Thoreau did, they might one day become valuable. His meticulous notes on the plants and birds at Walden are now a vital baseline for modern comparisons. One expert told me that if Thoreau was listed as a co-author on all of the papers now using his data, he would be one of the most prolific climate change scientists of the 21st century. But a modern spring isn't just earlier than what Thoreau saw, it's different. To Thoreau, it might seem like a season in disarray. And that's because not all species are responding in the same ways, and not all of them are responding at the same times. This flower is common throughout wildflower meadows here in the Pacific Northwest. It's known as death camas. And like many plants, it produces toxins to ward off would-be attackers. But unlike most other plants, it doesn't just put those chemicals into leaves and seeds and other places that are likely to be nibbled. It puts them everywhere, including into its pollen and nectar. What's more, the main toxin in that mix, zygosine, is especially nasty stuff. It attacks the heart, it attacks the lungs, and for good measure, it also attacks the digestive tract. The Latin name for death camas really says it all. Toxicoscordion venenosum venenosum. Poisonous bulb, poisonous, poisonous. So death camas is very well protected, but in terms of pollination, that puts it in a bit of a fix. How do you attract insects to your flowers when instead of a tasty reward, you're offering them seizures, paralysis, and, well, death? Enter the appropriately named death Camus bee, one of only a handful of insects and the only bee to have figured out a way to tolerate death camas poison. Now that gives the bee a nearly exclusive source of pollen and nectar, and it gives the flower a very dedicated and exclusive pollinator. It is a very tight, specialized, co-evolved relationship. But in many locations, the flowers are now blooming 2 or even 3 weeks earlier than they did just 30 years ago, responding to the warming air temperatures in springtime. The bee, on the other hand, nests in the ground, where temperatures are warming much more slowly. It's still on the old schedule. And if that continues, it threatens to pull these two co-evolved species apart, not in space, but in time. Biologists call this a timing mismatch, something that we worry about particularly for these sorts of specialist relationships. But similar things are showing up all over the place. As far north as the Arctic, where we find caribou in migration, sometimes arriving at their calving grounds now past the peak of productivity for the foliage that they were planning upon to rear their young. Similarly, birds in migration can arrive at coastal wetlands past the peak now of the invertebrates in those mudflats that they rely upon to fuel their long shorebird migrations. Of course, it can take years of study, decades even, to tease out the effects of these mismatches, to figure out what's really going on and whether or not it is truly a threat to the creatures involved. There are other aspects of climate change that are much more straightforward, extremes in weather, for example, which we all experienced across the Northwest this summer with our heat waves and the heat dome, if you will. But we see storms, we see droughts now, and we see hurricanes and all of these other extremes. And we see just hot weather, more and more hot weather. As one expert told me in an interview, sometimes he said it's pretty simple. Organisms just get too hot. And one such example comes to us from a somewhat surprising place, the American Southwest, where you might expect creatures to be well prepared for a warmer world. After all, they live in a desert. This story comes from Barry Sinervo, who is a herpetologist at UC Santa Cruz. He studies lizards, including this lizard, the western fence lizard, which, if your childhood was at all like mine, you tried and failed to catch, because the fence lizards always scurried away to hide under a nearby rock. Well, it turns out that fence lizards use rocks for a whole lot more than getting away from young lizard enthusiasts. They are what scientists call heliotherms. They use the sun to regulate their body temperature. So they bask on the tops of rocks when they need to warm up, and when they get too hot, they go beneath the rocks into the shade to cool down. They can't stay out in the sun indefinitely because they have no physical mechanism to dissipate that heat. They would overheat and risk perishing out in the sun. So they must stay close to rocks at all times so they can have a place to cool down. So as the climate has warmed and temperatures in these deserts have begun to rise, the lizards have done what they've always done on hot days. They have spent more time in the shade, but that comes as a cost. Because the more time you are spending hiding there under the rocks, the less time you have to be out searching for food. So as temperatures have risen, calorie intake by lizards has started to go down. And Barry and his team witnessed several fence lizards populations in particularly hot locations wink out completely before they realized what was going on. It wasn't the heat killing the lizards directly. It was a factor of calories, and the fact that for the females particularly, if they spent too much time in the shade, they weren't building enough energy reserves to be able to reproduce. In other words, as it got too hot, the lizards stopped breeding. And you don't need a PhD in herpetology to predict the long-term consequences of that. Now, another climate change challenge out there has to do with fans of what the Jungle Book would call the bare necessities of life. And what happens when some critical part of your habitat simply disappears? This is what we were really talking about at the beginning when you talk about the polar bears losing their pack ice. Well, that is a critical part of their habitat because it's where they hunt for seals. And if you don't have pack ice with seals on it like this to go hunting, you're in a bit of a bind. But if we could look past those big mammals at that very same pack ice, peer over the edge, you might catch a glimpse of another creature affected by the diminishment of that ice. a cute little seabird called the little auk or dovekie. Now, dovekies, for their history as a species, have spent much of their time at the edge of the pack ice foraging because it's a very rich place for plankton upon which they feed. Where that ice is melting away, there's a rich zone of plankton. But they have long been predicted to be one of the early victims of climate change because as the pack ice recedes farther and farther to the north, gets farther and farther away from the islands where the dovekies breed, the dovekies have farther to fly to get food to bring back all the way to feed to their chicks. And you can imagine as that distance becomes too great, the chicks begin to starve, population collapses, and you have local extinctions, at the very least, perhaps an overall extinction of dovekies. This has been the prediction for decades until scientists got out and took a look at what was going on in the field in a place called Franz Josef Land, which is an archipelago in the Russian Arctic, a marvelous place. And it brings us to an important point, that nature is not defenseless, that species are not passive bystanders to climate change. They respond, and they do so sometimes in ways that we would never expect. So let's catch up with this story again, straight out of the book. This comes from the chapter 8. And we were catching up with a scientist named David Haskell, who spent some time there in Franz Josef Land on an expedition to a distant Russian research site to study the dovekies. We had indeed strong hypotheses and predictions on how they would behave, Haskell explained, noting that birds in their previous studies had regularly flown over 60 miles to reach the edge of the pack ice. We were expecting flight times between the colony and the foraging spot of at least an hour, he went on. And then he recounted what he called, quote, one of the most exciting moments of my research career. Sitting with their laptops at the dinner table, surrounded by their Russian counterparts, they opened up that first batch of data and they saw precisely how long the birds had been in the air. Less than 4 minutes. Instead of trekking all the way to the edge of the sea ice, the dovekies had apparently found an alternative food source right on their doorstep. But what and where? It's easy to imagine the excited conjecture and conversation that came next, perhaps fortified with a sip or two of vodka. Soon their ideas began to coalesce around an entirely new hypothesis. My colleague, Jerome Fort, remembered what we had seen while climbing the nearby mountain with our Russian friends a week before, Haskell recalled, and he described a distinct line across the mouth of the fjord, where cloudy blue meltwater from island glaciers slammed into the dark, dense currents of the Arctic Ocean. Both Fort and Haskell had trained as oceanographers before they began studying birds, so they understood the consequences of such an abrupt transition. We both knew what this front meant, a curtain of plankton killed by temperature and osmotic shock. For tiny creatures, swimming so suddenly from one kind of water into another was like driving full speed into a wall. And for anything that fed upon those crustaceans, the resulting pileup created a bonanza. Testing their theory required a boat, but the only craft available was a, quote, chronically deflated dinghy. And the fuel they'd brought from Murmansk turned out to be contaminated with water. None of this was exactly ideal for exploring a polar sea, but they set off anyway and managed to sputter far enough out into the fjord for a survey. There wasn't much to see at first, but as they crossed the convergence zone between glacial meltwater and the ocean water, the dovekies were suddenly all around them. The little auks were all there, Haskell told me, aligned on the oceanic side, diving and stuffing themselves on plankton, easily picked from an underwater curtain. With that revelation, the story of dovekies and climate change switched instantly from one of decline to one of resilience. Yes, the sea ice was melting, as predicted, but so were Arctic glaciers. And in places like Franz Josef Land, where glaciers are plentiful, that created an opportunity that no one saw coming. Haskell and his team spent the remainder of their field season showing that dovekies weren't just surviving on their new food source, they were thriving. Chicks grew at precisely the same rate as they had on a traditional diet, measured decades earlier at the same location. To Haskell, the project demonstrated how one overlooked detail can have a huge effect on the outcome. Even if you think you know, he summarized, you really have to get out into the field to check what wild creatures are doing because they very often surprise you. David Gremelet's story embodies something that I heard again and again throughout my research for this book. How scientists went into the field expecting to study one thing and ended up studying something completely different because conditions on the ground were so different than what they expected. Different in terms of climate, but also different in terms of the lives and the behaviors of their subjects. The dovekies were able to pivot quickly to a new food source because they have what scientists call plasticity, very much like the old cartoon character, Plastic Man. There he is, and you can see how Plastic Man responded to any situation by bending and stretching his body into any shape. Well, in an era of climate change, we wish that all species had that capability because plasticity allows a quick response. And for some species, it applies to a lot more than simply their behavior. The humble squid, for example, virtually disappeared from traditional fishing grounds down in Mexico's Gulf of California after a series of climate-driven marine heat waves. Or so everybody thought, until they went out to do some surveys and found that the squid were not only still present, they were more plentiful than they had been before. Instead of departing, they had responded to heat stress with plasticity. They had adopted a radically different life strategy. Yes, they ate different foods, but they also matured and reproduced in half the time as before. They lived only half as long. And under those constraints, their new adult bodies reached only a fraction of the size of their former bodies, too small to bite on the lures that fishers had traditionally used to catch them. The few that people could hook, they had been throwing back, dismissing them as juveniles or perhaps even another species altogether. Now, most climate change responses we have measured to date are some variation on that theme of plasticity, some aspect of behavior or physiology already baked in to a species' genome, to their genetic code. But there are some tantalizing examples now of evolution playing out in response to climate change. And one of the best comes from another lizard, this creature here, a small anole native to the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean. Colin Donahue, who's now at Washington University, had just surveyed a population of these lizards as part of a larger study. They were going to remove non-native rats from this island and see how the native ecosystem responded. The rats had been eating lizards and other things, and so they went out and measured a whole bunch of stuff, including these lizards, Colin's specialty. And then a hurricane struck and his research took a turn. So let us catch up with this from chapter 8 of the book, which also begins with a quotation, this time from Giuseppe Lampedusa's novel, The Leopard. He wrote, "If we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change." Actually, it was 2 hurricanes, Donahue clarified, when I called to ask him how the story played out. Hurricane Irma struck first, pummeling the eastern Caribbean with torrential rains, storm surge, and Category 5 winds exceeding 175 miles per hour. Just 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria swept through with similar force. The combined storms devastated low-lying islands like the ones where Donahue's lizards lived, uprooting trees, flattening structures, and leaving both natural and human communities reeling. Needless to say, researchers put the rat project on an indefinite hold, but for Donahue, that setback also offered an opportunity. While his questions about lizards and rats would have to wait, he was now in the perfect position to study the effects of hurricanes. Had any lizards survived? And if so, were the surviving lizards different from the population he'd just measured? We had no idea what to expect, he told me, but I knew we weren't going to get another chance at that kind of data. So he cobbled together some funding, headed back to the Caribbean, and found himself in a sort of scientific deja vu, repeating the exact same field study he had just completed 6 weeks earlier. We were on a short timeline, so it was pretty much catching and measuring lizards all day long, Donahue recalled. But he described the trip with obvious pleasure, as if this were precisely how anyone would want to spend their time on a tropical island. In conversation, Donahue's enthusiasm for science borders on exuberance. He comes across as someone who probably keeps working and thinking long after other people might quit for the day and retire to the poolside bar. That may be why he recognized the potential value of returning so soon to resurvey his lizards, and it's almost certainly why it occurred to him to bring along a leaf blower. The customs officer was very confused, he said, and then laughed out loud at the memory of trying to explain the science behind traveling with a large piece of landscaping equipment. We needed to know how the lizards behaved in a hurricane-force wind, he told me. It was possible they might run for it or hunker down in the tree roots. We didn't know. And since watching lizards in a real hurricane was out of the question, Donahue used the leaf blower to simulate one inside his hotel room. And I have to say, I have always wondered what the people in the next room thought about that. I mean, it's one thing if someone turns the TV on kind of loud, but a leaf blower. Well, at any rate, Colin was kind enough to share with me a video of that experiment so that we can all see what he saw in that hotel room. And before I play it, let me assure you that no lizards were harmed. There is a soft net right off camera, and every individual was captured, recaptured, and safely returned to the wild within 2 hours. So without further ado, let me give you a hurricane lizard. The wind begins. You can see the back legs slipping off, holding on for dear life, holding on as long as possible. The wind picks up until finally he just can't. A hurricane lizard. So climate change biology is full of these kinds of surprises. Colin was blown away by this video because it explained everything that he had been seeing in the data when they resurveyed those lizards. Yes, the surviving population was different. The survivors of the hurricanes all had certain characteristics. They had larger toe pads than the average before the hurricanes for holding on tight. And they had strong front legs, again, for gripping those branches and twigs for as long as possible in the wind. And they also had, and this was mysterious before he saw the video, they had short back legs. But that was explained by the way the lizards were flapping like a flag in the wind, because shorter back legs meant less drag and they could hold on just a little bit longer, which might have been the difference for them between life and death. So what he realized after this project was that he had witnessed and measured natural selection in action, survival of the fittest, evolution driven by climate change playing out not over hundreds or thousands of years, but playing out within a single field season. And that is just the sort of thing that climate change biologists are finding all over the world. These surprises in the way that species are reacting, either through plasticity or through evolution playing out in real time. Now, we have been talking about all sorts of these challenges, from timing to extreme weather. And I have to tell you, we haven't even scratched the surface. Consider movement, for example, one of the most straightforward of all climate change responses. Between 25 and 85% of the species on the planet are estimated to now be shifting their ranges in response to climate change, fanning out across landscapes and oceanscapes, searching for the temperatures and other conditions that they are used to. Even at the low end of that estimate, that is a quarter of all life on Earth. So climate-driven upheavals are impacting all kinds of fundamental ecological processes, from competition to predation to hybridization, parasitism, and yes, even extinction. The mouse-like brambleKey melomies in Australia recently became the first mammal species confirmed as a climate change casualty when all of its known habitat was inundated by sea level rise. So studying climate change biology doesn't make scientists necessarily worry less about the crisis, but it can help them to worry smart, allocating scarce resources to the species and systems that really need our help the most. And that's important at a personal level too, as we all struggle to allocate our limited emotional capital to this crisis. We need to know what to worry about. So yes, it is daunting, but I argue that climate change deserves our curiosity as well as our concern, because after all, it is hard to solve a problem if we aren't even interested in it. Now, in a moment, I want to take your questions from the chat and so forth, but first let me end with a passage from the conclusion of the book that begins with an epigraph from the Bard, from Shakespeare, from King John, where he wrote, "Strong reasons make strong actions." I subscribe to a philosophy expressed to me by Gordon Orions, an eminent American biologist whose 7-decade career has spanned everything from blackbird behavior to the evolution of fear. When asked what a concerned citizen should do about climate change, his response was immediate and concise: everything you can. In that simple phrase, Orions managed to capture both urgency and agency, the seriousness of the issue combined with the importance of taking action at a relevant scale. It's not a new idea. 19th century thinker Edward Everett Hale expressed something similar in a verse conceived long before anyone was worried about their carbon footprint. "I cannot do everything, but still I can do something," he wrote. "And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do." The value of the advice from both Orions and Hale lies in their choice of the word can, a verb that is rooted in possibility and adaptable to any circumstance. It helps us focus our energy on tasks immediately at hand, tangible things like how we drive, shop, eat, travel, protest, vote, do the laundry, or even cut the grass. Naysayers will claim that taking personal action is trivial, an empty gesture in the face of a problem so large. But that position is wrong, and not just slightly wrong. It is the opposite of the truth. In nature, we have seen how the responses of individual organisms determine the fates of populations, of species, and whole ecosystems. The same patterns apply to society. Addressing climate change requires a fundamental cultural shift in our relationship to energy, from how we produce it to how much of it our lifestyles demand. That makes individual action more important, not less so, because it is the collective behaviors and attitudes of individuals that define and change a culture. Yes, we need stronger climate policies and strong leadership to carry them forward, but those things will be the results of cultural change, not the cause of it. Doing everything one can about climate change is also a fitting approach biologically, because that is precisely what plants and animals are doing. Their responses are playing out all around us every day, a constant thrumming call to action. Because in spite of the complexity of our societies and the technologies that we surround ourselves with, in the end, we're just one more species on a changing world, facing the same climate challenges and drawing on the same basic toolbox of potential solutions, with one notable difference. Unlike any other organism on the planet, people have the ability to do more than simply react to climate change. If we so choose, we can alter the behaviors that are causing it to happen. With that, I will conclude my presentation. One shout out to all the people who shared images for that, and then we will move on to question and answer. And there's Lane. Good.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tor. That was very good. And for anybody who has any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat. And I'm glad that you kind of ended on the note that you did, because it segues into a couple questions that I have. And the first one, and you can kind of come at this any way that you like, and I think that the book in general perhaps hints at or answers this in a few different ways, but is there anything, or what would you, if you could wave a magic wand, change about the climate change discourse or the way that it is presented to the general public? Because I think the book, takes an angle that is not one that is usually presented in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would answer that by saying we have spent now 30 or 40 years mostly arguing about the causes of climate change. And if you look out in nature, you will see that plants and animals have spent the last 30 or 40 years getting on with it. They are responding and dealing with it and coping with it, or not. There's resilience, and there are species that are also, like our bramble key melomes, slipping away. But I think we can take some inspiration from the responses that we see there out in nature. And that is a way that I like to steer the discourse, because I believe that curiosity is a very powerful tool in terms of dealing with climate change. And it's often overlooked. I think we tend to feel despair at a crisis so large, but despair leads to despair, where curiosity leads to learning and it leads to action. And so that is part of the climate change discussion that I felt was missing, and something that I was hoping to help fill in by working on this book.
Yeah, and I think actually, so your son is a figure who pops up a couple times in the book through these sort of household experiments and stuff. And I'm curious if that relationship has helped you introduce that curiosity into your work and how you present this to other people, to try to come at it with like a childlike wonder.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to confront this in daily life, not just when we sit down to read an article or something in the news or have a conversation, but really thinking about climate change in the background of our lives and what's going on. And I think that way often anyway about biology. That's my specialty. And I want this sort of natural history to be part of how we live, remind ourselves of these connections. And so it's very natural then for me as a writer to, in describing my life and as I go through the process of discovery in these books, to include those examples when these things crop up for me and for my son as we're going about our daily business. My God, we find this thing in the pickle jar, and there you are. Here we have this marvelous example that was hiding in the refrigerator. And so those sorts of things I think are important, not only personally, just to keep these questions alive, but also as an example of how this is not a topic that is academic entirely. It is a lifestyle topic, and we can see it all around us all the time.
Yeah, this is something that I'm fascinated and constantly frustrated by, both on a personal level going through college and everything, but just watching, the way the world works, is this idea of science communication. And that's something that I guess is less of a question, but so admired about your book, is that you do make it accessible and, relatable, and examples that anybody can wrap their minds around. Whereas, sometimes it does seem as though the folks who are on the forefront of this research, either have little interest in or little ability to communicate this in a way that, you need stories and emotion in these things in order to get people involved.
Yeah, I agree. I think, for me, coming through the training as a scientist and seeing so many fascinating ideas and discoveries that never made it beyond the scientific community and the peer-reviewed papers, which are a very vital, important part of science, but there are a lot of times where we really need to take those discoveries farther. And that is really what got me interested in this sort of storytelling of science, and trying to communicate those things more broadly, in a way that we can all relate to, because everyone can relate to that curiosity, that fundamental question mark, that, this sense of discovery that's going on all the time in these projects that drives the whole enterprise. But it often, as you point out, gets lost when we publish our very objective, peer-reviewed papers. And, as scientists, people are busy, and either, they don't have the interest or the ability or even the time to turn around and try to communicate that more broadly. I remember at one point years ago thinking that every time I publish a scientific paper, I'm going to publish a popular article that explains it. That was going to be my goal. And I managed to do it once, and then I was too busy. So I really realized at some point that for my career, a contribution I could make would be to focus more and more of my time on that storytelling, on the communication, and try to get science out there in a broad way.
Yeah, and speaking of, we actually have a question from the audience that if you weren't busy enough, Mary asks if you've thought about or perhaps been approached about like a graphic novel version of your book that would appeal to young people and get them more engaged, or just a kid's version of your work.
That is a wonderful idea. I think a graphic novel version would be fabulous. There's been a bit of discussion about taking certain stories from it, as there are some sort of middle reader books that talk about scientists and what they do, and we've had some preliminary discussions about that. But I think the graphic novel idea is even better. To have it illustrated as such would be fabulous. So there are some glimmerings of hope there, and I'm going to now put your idea, Mary, into the mix, because I think that would be fabulous.
Yeah, I think that would be a really cool format for this information. And as a bookseller, I am obliged to mention that there are a lot of really great kids nonfiction picture books and graphic novels for like reluctant readers that do exist. So if you contact your local indie bookstore, I'm sure that those folks would be happy to recommend some stuff. So in the book, you mention that you were, or perhaps are, a U.S. Forest Service ranger, and you had worked with in Alaska and done some grizzly bear observing. And so I just finished reading a couple weeks ago The Bears of Brooks Falls by Michael Fitz, which we did an event with. And I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about some of how that figured into the book and the observation about the bears.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's a great story. I worked, it's many years ago now, up in Alaska on a brown bear project for the Forest Service. And one of the things we always observed was when the bears were feeding, when the salmon runs were at their peak there, they often were very selective about what they ate. They would eat the brain and throw the rest of the way. They would peel off the fatty skin or eat the belly out with the eggs and throw the rest away. They were very selective, getting the fattiest parts of those fish. A habit I recognized, coming from a Scandinavian family where, we would line up at the buffet line for the salmon barbecue, and whoever was first in line got the belly and the fatty bits. Everybody in the family knew. So the bears are the same. They were going for the fat. And why was that? Well, it turns out that a protein-rich diet for bears is not all that different from a protein-rich diet for people. And you will see people occasionally on these fad diets like the Atkins diet or the South Beach diet, where all you eat is protein or largely protein, no carbohydrates to speak of, and people drop weight on that. You can't process that into fat very well. Same is true for bears. So even though salmon are extremely abundant, it's not necessarily the most balanced diet for them. So typically the theory was that the bears were feasting on this salmon and building up their fat reserves as best they could because they needed big fat reserves to hibernate through the winter. Then after the salmon were done, they would switch over and eat more berries that had some carbs and add on even more fat at that time. And all along, it turns out there was a sort of magic food for bears hiding in plain sight. And a fellow named Will Deasy up on Kodiak Island discovered this because he was interested in bears and how they always seem to be at the peak of the salmon runs in these different watersheds, lots of different rivers and creeks on Kodiak. And the bears would move around and time their movements to always arrive when the salmon were really running in these various rivers. And so he went up there, radio tagged 40 bears, and he had people counting fish in the streams and seeing how the bears moved around. He wanted to understand the economy, if you will, of the bears and how they managed their time. And it was all going great. And then right in the middle of the field season, they disappeared. The bears just up and left the streams. And he said it was a lucky thing they had them radio tagged because they could find out where they were going. And they had moved up into the surrounding hills and they were feasting on a particular berry, the red elderberry, which, responding to climate change, had gone into fruit weeks and weeks earlier than it used to. Just like the wildflowers we were talking about at Walden Pond, those shrubs were blooming earlier in the spring because it was warmer. They were fruiting earlier, and suddenly it had created this conflict for the bears. Would they stick with the salmon, this abundant resource, or would they switch and go to these berries that were blooming early? And the salmon were left behind as the bears trucked up the hillside to get to these berries, because it turns out that elderberries, and people hadn't realized this precisely, are almost a perfect bear food because they have carbohydrates like the berries they had been eating later in the fall, including the elderberries, which used to bloom or fruit then. But they also have quite a lot for a berry, protein, 13% or more, which is a perfect combination for bears in terms of adding fat. So when they were forced to choose, it revealed to Will and the other researchers that this was a perfect bear food that had sort of been hiding in plain sight all along. And the bears, because they're flexible, have some behavioral plasticity. They could adjust their schedule to take advantage of it even earlier in the season. And in doing so, hopefully adapt their behaviors to climate change and still put on the fat reserves they need to get through winter.
Yeah, I love that story so much. And I love how many kind of stories like that in this book there are, of almost these like cinematic style light bulb scientific moments where, like the missing bears or the flight of the dovekie, where you plug in the data and you're going, what the heck is going on? And then there's a light bulb moment, and it just really illustrates all the creative hiding in plain sight solutions that life will find. So I'm curious if there are any new climate change biology questions, whether that like just made it into the book at the last minute or that aren't in the book and that are like truly new that you've been dwelling on the most recently.
It's such a dynamic field. There's so much being discovered. And one of the really neat papers that just came out in the last month or so has to do with how bodies are changing to adapt to increased warmth. And there are lots of theories about this that we've known about for years in terms of where species live. So related species in the equator versus, related species in the north. Well, as you get into cooler conditions, the creatures get larger, right? It's in terms of holding on to heat more efficiently and so forth. So as things get warmer, creatures tend to get smaller. Another similar example would be for birds, for example. If you can imagine the life of a bird, or the poor things, they're living this high velocity, high metabolism, athletic lifestyle, flying around. It's like running a marathon every day, and they're wearing a sleeping bag. So how do they dispel all of that heat? Right? And they've got a down sleeping bag on, and they have a few little bare patches where they can dispel some heat, but they dispel also through shunting blood down to their bare legs and also into their bills. Any place where they have some bare skin or what have you, they'll try to get rid of some heat that way. And of course, through their breathing as well. So you see, larger bare patches in hotter environments. And so someone had the good, presence of mind to ask that question in terms of climate change. If things are getting hotter for birds, for example, are we seeing, the size of their bare patches increase? Are their bills getting larger, for example? And this was done down in Australia, or one of the key studies in this sort of big review they did was on a parrot species down in Australia, where they have a record because people have been collecting them for museum specimens for 130, 140 years. And so they just went in and they measured all the bills. And in fact, that they could determine through those measurements, the locations from where they were all collected and the temperature changes in those locations. They could see that the bills of these parrots had grown by 10% over that period of time, which in terms of evolution is not a long time. So you see birds now with noticeably larger bills, specifically for dispelling their body heat into a hotter world. And then looking more broadly, these examples started cropping up all over the place for different sorts of animals and how they're processing that heat and how they're getting rid of it. And so their bodies are changing. Anywhere now that you have a long enough record to see this process in a place that's getting remarkably hotter, for many creatures now, you can see their bodies responding as part of that. Some through plasticity, because some people have bigger bills than others, right? There's some plasticity built in, but also now the hints of real evolution, directional selection, changing those features in the species.
Yeah, it's cool to see it happening in real time. It's very fascinating. We have time for a couple more questions, and I want to shift to some sort of process-related stuff. And if anybody has any more questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A down there at the bottom. And there are some examples in the book of creative approaches to doing this type of research. But I'm curious how the pandemic has affected the process of doing all this, and if there are any kind of cool examples of workarounds that, particularly in that first year, cropped up.
Great question. And the pandemic certainly changed research plans all over the place, disrupted a lot of things that people would normally have done from the scientific side of things, but also created some opportunities. And one of those that I think is really fascinating is the increase in individual observations from lay people. Citizen science has been booming already, but then the pandemic, when people were forced to be at home or chose even longer periods to be rooted at home, we're natural observers. We're born to do this, to see things. And when we are in our own environment, our own backyards, our nearby parks where we're allowed, and wherever the lockdown restrictions allowed people to go, people started seeing things. And some of those things were, creatures taking advantage of the slowdown in activity. So, wild boars roaming the streets of Barcelona, if you will, and, orca whales getting into the harbor there in Victoria and in Vancouver, where there was far less ship traffic, those sorts of things. But a lot of it had to do with being more present in our own backyards and so forth, and seeing things that had been there all along. And because of the ability for scientists to connect to people through the internet and Zoom and all these various things, and all these citizen science projects where you can collect data wherever you happen to be, there's been a huge uptick in projects gathering data from all sorts of places in a way we couldn't do before, and using that to better understand what's happening in terms of climate change and many other research questions as well. But it's been very intriguing to see that go on, in the climate change biology world. Lots of great citizen science.
Very cool. And we just dropped into the chat a link to adventurescientists.org, which is a citizen science organization. So a question from the audience. My son graduated a few months ago, majoring in environmental studies. He is extremely interested in animal behavior and nutrition. How could he go about working with someone like you?
Yeah, well, there are all sorts of opportunities in terms of getting involved in field work. And that's really has always been my passion. I mean, I've done plenty of work in the lab too, but I do love the field aspect of biology. And I think it's a great way to not only, get outside and see things, but to train your mind in terms of how you ask questions. Because as we've had several examples today, things are often different than you expect, particularly now with climate change altering ecosystems at such a rapid pace. So what I always suggest to people, if they want to get some hands-on experience, is to look at, there are places like the Ecological Society of America and other sort of professional web hubs, if you will, where scientists advertise when they need help in the field. And they need people to come out and help on these projects, just as we were describing, sort of citizen science backyard stuff. But you also need help when you go out sometimes, to study the bears, or if you get out to, take data on plant life in forests, or any creatures that you can imagine. All of these projects, oftentimes you need more bodies on the project. And so scientists, graduate students, professors, and so forth from academia will advertise the positions they need to fill. And if you are a young biologist looking for opportunities, it's a great way to get your foot in the door, because you go out and, it doesn't pay much usually, but you get room and board and you're on a field project. And the key thing is, in addition to the experience of seeing how the science actually works in the field, you also get to know all these scientists. And like any other field or community, there's a lot of personal references that go on with that. And I would reference again the fellow I mentioned with the Bear Project, Will Deasy, who when I was quizzing him about his background, he described his path as, he said, I did the usual thing, and I worked on a chameleon project and a scorpion project. And, he did a whole bunch of different stuff. And then he said that led him not only to a lot of people and opportunities then to go on in graduate school, but it also is how he learned about his passion for bears was through a field project like that. And so it's a great way to get your foot in the door as an up and coming scientist.
Yeah, the book was full of examples of people who thought they were studying one thing for 15 years and then one day woke up and realized, oh gosh, I've actually been studying this other thing, or where it leads them to this thing that was just a factor in their primary study, but it became the primary thing afterwards. So we have one more question from the audience, which I think is a great one to wrap on. And someone asks, I also live in the San Juan Islands and am interested in what climate change adaptations you have observed in our intertidal zones.
Or lack thereof. And I would point us to the recent heat wave. And it's quite interesting, to think about this from a number of perspectives, not just what we see daily, but even in terms of evolutionary time. And if you look at one of the results of that heat wave, the temperatures on some of the beaches here in the Northwest, the islands, and then north, the research on this was done up closer to Vancouver, but very nearby. At extreme low tides that were happening, it was in June, and that's when we got our lowest tides. We had temperatures on the beach reaching 120 degrees, literally cooking intertidal creatures in their shells. Because if you talk about resilience, They can't move. They're stuck in the sun. It's too hot, and they literally cooked alive in their shells. And an estimated billion sea creatures lost on those hot days. And I think that's instructive in a number of ways, in that if you think about the evolutionary history of species, one of the things that can make them more or less resilient in terms of climate change is if they have existed for a long time and persisted through a lot of different environmental conditions. And they may have accumulated abilities to withstand those conditions over time. And maybe those abilities have been lying dormant for millions or thousands of years, what have you, but they haven't gone away. And so when you see those conditions again, it triggers those genes to respond. And this is part of the plasticity that we see within organisms. One of the theories is that older species may, in some cases, have accumulated more of those responses. So when you see a situation like this intertidal disaster in June, you realize not only is this terrible for the creatures here, but you realize, they're probably being exposed to something that they've never been exposed to in their evolutionary history, right? If you see mussels, they can withstand a lot. I mean, it gets pretty hot at high tide, and you've got a creature that wants to be underwater and at high tide, in a normal day, they can survive that. They're pretty tough. They've seen a lot, but this is something that is beyond whatever extremes they've probably experienced in the past. And that's instructive in that it tells us, okay, we're dealing with conditions on the ground that are truly outside of normal boundaries. So it's another sign of the severity of what's going on now, not just the speed of the change, but the extremes that some of these atmospheric events are creating for species on the ground.
All right. Well, thank you. And I think that that's a good place for us to wrap up. The book is Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid by Thor Hanson. And thank you, Thor, so much for joining us. It's truly a pleasure, and I really enjoyed reading the book. And I admit that I haven't read any of your others, but I'm going to take them all home from the store soon and add them to my stack of things to read. It was really enjoyable. Thank you, everybody who joined us this evening. And remember that you can share this event among your friends via our YouTube recording for the Books in Common Northwest channel. And we'll see everybody next time. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you again, Thor.
My pleasure. Thanks to